Good luck, Let me know if
Upon graduation, Jack enlisted in the United States Marine Corps. After boot camp and a year on stateside duty, he served in Vietnam with Charlie Company, 1st Battalion, 4th Marine Regiment, 3rd Marine Division. Jack returned to enter Harvard University in the fall of 1968 as the college's first Vietnam veteran. He has since enjoyed a career as a successful marketing executive, most recently as the founding managing partner of the Greater Washington Initiative. His first book, Loon, A Marine Story, is a memoir about these experiences, which went on to be a national bestseller. Tonight, he is here to speak about his new title, Found, A Veteran Story, which is a fascinating journey about a Marine grunt's quest for healing the wounds of his war and how he discovered the best medicine of all was tracking down and reuniting with his fellow survivors and with the families of the fallen. So, please put your hands together and greet the crowd.
Thank you. Thanks to the next chapter. And what a great story. I mean, we lost the book review, but we got the next chapter. So I think that step by step, we've got our story back and a lot of committed people here. His military service begins when you raise your hand and you take an oath. After that, it's up to the government. Comedian George Goebel, who some of you may remember, enlisted in the United States Army Air Corps after the start of World War II, and for the next 5 years, never left Oklahoma. If President Roosevelt had wanted me to serve someplace else, he used to say, he would have sent me there. The 2,335 members of the Navy, Marine Corps, and Army who were killed at Pearl Harbor 82 years ago today entered the military service during peacetime. When you raise your hand, there is no guarantee other than that the satisfaction and honor that comes from serving your country. So for the veterans that are here, I thank you for your service. We're here today because of those of you now and those that came before. Found, A Veteran Story, has been called a feel-good memoir. It is about this former Vietnam Marine who found his way to post-traumatic recovery from the mental and physical wounds of war. I attribute my successful recovery over 44 years to these three factors. First, writing this book and its predecessor, Loon, A Marine Story, that was published by Random House in 2009. Next, the Department of Veterans Affairs, particularly the VA medical centers in Washington, D.C., Hampton, Virginia, East Orange, New Jersey, and right here in Northport. All outstanding institutions, I owe them my life. And third, reconnecting with my Marine Corps buddies after over 30 years apart and welcoming into my life the widow and child of one dear fallen comrade in arms. You will get to know them all very well as you go through the pages of this book. I'm now reading from the book, even though it looks like I'm reading from a page, so I can make it in print that I could see. Tom used to tell us what it was like to grow up in Dover, New Hampshire, with his parents and 7 siblings. I was from the Boston area, so we shared a New England tie. He'd also rhapsodize about his wife, Norma, and their young son, Tom III. On occasion, he'd produce a grainy photo of the two. "That's some kid, huh?" he used to say. "Yeah, Tom," he'd definitely reply. "That's some kid." Then he'd point to his wife and say, "Isn't she a knockout?" And we'd say, "Yes, Tom. She is a knockout," because, in fact, she was. I recalled the devastating artillery barrage on Landing Zone Loon on June 5th, 1968. Shortly after it began, the call went out for volunteers to ferry the wounded to a makeshift landing zone for evacuation. Tom and several others immediately sprang from their fighting holes. I paused. Air bombardments were often followed by ground assaults. I thought some of us should stay in place to defend the perimeter. The last time I saw Tom, several minutes later, he was in a slow motion jog with a wounded Marine slung over his right shoulder. Then in a flash, he was gone. 39 other boys were killed during that battle, and another 100 of us were wounded. While those of us who survived were well beyond fortunate, the 3 days of horror would remain inextricably etched into each of us for the rest of our lives. Found, a veteran story, is a book about the long-term consequences of that one awful moment. It's a story about the brief life of Thomas J. Morrissey Jr. It's a story about Tom's widow, Norma, and their then 14-month-old son, Thomas III. It's a story about my buddies and me and our recovery from that moment over the next 44 years. And it's a story about America, its people, its institutions, its government, and how their attitudes about Vietnam veterans changed over that time. In his history of the Peloponnesian Wars, Thucydides wrote, "Do not take lightly the perils of war." As any combat veteran knows, those perils only begin on the battlefield. I've selected 3 passages to read that elaborate on elements of my recovery. I'll begin with my first visit to the VA in Washington, D.C. Follow up with my reconnection with a Vietnam buddy, my commanding officer, Bill Negron, who many of you may have gotten to know if you read Moon, or this book now. And I'll conclude with my first visit to the Newark office of the Vietnam Veterans of America. How are we doing so far?
Awesome.
Everybody hear me okay? I'm fine. The VA. On November 3rd, 2003, after years of fruitless talk therapy with civilian psychologists and a continuing concern about my mental health, I finally decided to see if the VA could help me. Terry Tillery had urged me to file a disability claim for PTSD, but before I did, I wanted to speak with someone who could tell me if I really did have an actual combat disability or if I was just fucked up. Armed with my passport and DD-214 discharge papers, I drove across town to the Washington, D.C. VA Medical Center on Irving Street. The registration office was on the ground floor. I gave the clerk my DD-214. She gave me a clipboard with a questionnaire attached and directed me to one of several plastic chairs outside of her office. After sitting down, I gazed up at the wall in front of me and saw 2 photographic portraits. The one on the left was of Anthony Princepi, Secretary of the Department of Veterans Affairs. The one on the right was of George W. Bush, the 43rd President of the United States. Life's funny, I thought to myself. President Bush and I had spent 3 years together as students at Phillips Academy in Andover. Now, 4 decades later, he was blankly smiling down on me as I was contemplating the questionnaire that might well save my life. Halfway down the first page of the questionnaire, there was a box to check if I had ever had suicidal feelings. While I had experienced such feelings, I had never actually tried to kill myself. Still, the questionnaire asked about suicidal feelings. So I checked the yes box, moved down to the next question. Paperwork completed, I returned the clipboard to the clerk. Then minutes later, she called me into her office, confirmed several items, took my picture with a camera affixed to her desk, and produced my official VA identification card. In closing, she said, "They want to see you in room 423 immediately, Mr. McLean. The elevators are out the door to the left." I thanked her, put the card in my wallet, and walked to the elevators. When I got to the waiting area for 423, I was told to have a seat, but before I could, my name was called. "Mr. McLean." I turned, saw a man in a white lab coat standing by the door. I nodded in acknowledgement. "Please come with me," he said. It was all business. I followed him down the hall and into a small conference room, which was occupied by 3 other white-jacketed people. 2 were psychiatrists, the other was a psychologist. From that moment on, I was treated with all of the respect and urgency of a live hand grenade, which, in retrospect, I probably was. Fact was, after years of fruitless talk therapy, within minutes of my arrival at the Washington, D.C. VA Medical Center, they knew exactly what was wrong with me. 45 minutes later, after answering questions about the state of my life and my emotional health, I was admitted to the hospital for a night of observation. The next morning, having determined that I was not an immediate threat to myself or anyone else, I was discharged and ordered to enter the VA's mandatory 9-month PTSD protocol. I've been in their capable hands since that day. When I came back from Vietnam, I really did not see anybody that I'd served with for another 30 plus years. Not a person. And I just thought it was me. I was going off to, there weren't a lot of people in Cambridge when I was there. There weren't a lot of people that were any place else I was, and I didn't care anyway. So, I didn't want to talk to anybody. And that nobody wanted to talk to me was fine. On a gray November morning in 1992, sitting alone in my 11th floor office on 13th Street, the memory of the Loon battle not only rose to the surface, but demanded attention. I thought of the dead, their families, and my long-lost brothers in arms. For the first time in 24 years, I was eager to reestablish a connection with anyone who had been there. I thought if I could locate just 1 or 2 of them, we could begin the long road back into the sunlight together. Then perhaps we could find others. I recall that Bill Negron had gone to Miami University in Ohio on that November afternoon. On that November afternoon, I called the alumni office, was given his address in Scottsdale, Arizona. But you couldn't do that anymore, right? Several days later, uncertain that he would remember me, I wrote him a letter that began, "Dear Skipper, there must be little in you that would recall me after 25 years back in the world. But your memory rekindles in me often in the most positive way." I imagine that Bill and the others were attending reunions, remembering old times, and engaging in a form of camaraderie in which I had no interest. Now, though, for the first time, I wondered what had happened to them all. Would Captain Negron remember me? Did he remember Loon? Since my departure, he had likely fought in other battles that had left fresher scars. I awaited Bill's reply with high anticipation that was tempered with low expectations. It arrived 2 weeks later. "Dear Jack, there's still a part of my memory left that recalls you. Not many of my troopers left Vietnam to go to Harvard. I've only been to the wall once. It was one of those snowy, cold winter days in D.C. My tears ran down my face. Yes, Charlie Company is well represented on that black marble. Bill Negron remembered me, and he remembered Loon. Several days later, I was surprised to receive a letter from Bill's wife, Myrna. "Dear Jack," she wrote, "the letter you wrote my husband, Bill Negron, brought him to tears. He believes very strongly that his kids from Vietnam may be suffering. He feels responsible for every man that served with him and didn't make it back. It was reassuring to know that I had not been alone, that the nightmares were real. All those boys really had died. He later told me that I had been the first Charlie Company veteran with whom he'd had any contact since he returned home. 30 years. He too had been suffering in silence. I realized that many of the others probably were as well. That I was the first to find Bill said much about Vietnam veterans and how alone we felt, if we felt anything at all. Bill and I continued to correspond through letters, email, and occasional phone calls. 3 years later, I flew out to Phoenix to see him. The last time I'd seen Bill was on the day that I'd left Charlie Company in July 1968. We recognized each other as soon as I came out of the jetway. He was taller than I remembered, but otherwise looked almost the same. We drove to a bar in Scottsdale that was near his home, found a quiet booth near the back, and spent the rest of the day drinking beer and talking about our lives. He'd had a distinguished 25-year career in the Marine Corps that included a third tour in Vietnam. When he retired as a lieutenant colonel in August 1981, he was the highest ranking Marine Corps officer of Puerto Rican descent. A remarkable man in my life. I can think of a few people who've been, had the impact on my life, as Nina well knows, that Bill Negron has. We continued to see him up until he died about 2 years ago, and I was very honored to give the eulogy at his funeral. We had full military honors, flyover, pretty cool, just a remarkable man. You'll read. He was a key character in Loon, and he becomes as with this, a fairly key character in this book as well, because I end up seeing a lot more of him as you will read. How are we doing? Great. Should I keep going? Please.
Keep going.
Take a seat.
Yeah.
The third piece I wanted to read was about my first visit to the Vietnam Veterans of America. The VVA is like other veteran service organizations, is licensed by the government to represent veterans in front of the government or in front of the VA on matters in front of the VA. Among others are the VFW, the American Legion, with whom you may be familiar, and some smaller ones. But there was no group probably that made a bigger difference in the fate or in the future of Vietnam veterans than the Vietnam Veterans of America when they were founded in the mid-'80s by a gentleman from Glen Cove, Long Island, right here. When we came home, there was I'll digress for a minute. When we came home, after a while, I mean, those of you who were around in those days remember what it was like for Vietnam veterans, and remember what and not necessarily how we were treated. I don't say that we were necessarily treated badly. I just say people were generally ambivalent about the service. So we didn't, we just didn't, we didn't talk about it. And my first visit to a VFW when I was in Cambridge, I was greeted with disdain. I was the 25-year-old kid with long hair, chinos, weegeons, college kid, and they were all the local Cambridge World War II Korea vets. They were hawks. I was presumably a dove. I didn't know why somebody had to be a hawk or a dove. I didn't understand all that. I just wanted to talk to somebody. Some guys were playing cards, some guys were having a drink, but nobody welcomed me, nobody said welcome home, nobody encouraged me to join. They went back to what they're doing, and I left. And until I walked into the VBA office, those many years later, I never went into one again. And it's true with many Vietnam veterans. I acknowledge also in the 80s, Agent Orange as a disability was not recognized, even though its main component, dioxin, was banned in the United States. And PTSD, until 1982, was not recognized by the American Psychological Association as a legitimate ailment. So without that, The VA basically couldn't serve something that, as far as they were concerned, didn't exist. It's now 2009, and I've been reunited with a lot of my buddies. I'm living in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Lewin has been written. It's just published, so I have a little bit of time in my hands. On the afternoon of December 12, 2009, while driving home from an appointment at the VA Medical Center in East Orange, I decided to stop by the Newark office of the VVA, Vietnam Veterans America. I was grateful for their help in the Washington office had given me when I filed a disability claim years before, so I thought I would introduce myself to their local representative. As with most VSOs, they were housed in the same building as the regional VA. That's not to be confused with VA medical centers. This is like the administrative side. VA medical centers were, at that time, and still obviously, all computerized. I mean, the care, I could go from Hampton to East Orange to anywhere, and everybody, every doctor I saw, everybody knew everything. It was all right there on the screen in front of them. The VA, like the disability part, everything was still on 3x5 file cards. It was extraordinary. And some of you may remember, some of the problems when a lot of the Iraq and Afghanistan kids started coming home en masse. They were just overwhelmed. And at this time, for the first time, they were starting to actually entertain disability claims from Vietnam veterans for the first time in 30 years. Anyway, I decided to stop by. Figured I'd introduce myself to the local representative. As with most VSOs, they were housed in the local VA. I got to the seventh floor office. The door was locked. I tried knocking. "Hang on a minute, I'm on the phone." A female voice came from within. After waiting outside for several minutes, I heard approaching footsteps and the door swung open. "Well?" she asked. I was face to face with a sturdy middle-aged woman with a full head of graying hair. She had a well-seasoned look of someone who had been through a few things herself. "Is this the VVA?" I asked. "Who wants to know?" She snapped back with a slight smile while ushering me in. "Take a seat over there," she said, pointing to a worn chair sitting in front of a well-ordered metal desk. A corkboard on the adjacent wall was covered with snapshots of soldiers, military units, insignias, inspirational cards from all manner of personnel, and professional paraphernalia. "Who are you with?" she asked after setting herself in behind the desk. "Excuse me?" The question caught me off guard. "With, Army, Navy, what branch of the service were you in?" she asked. She clarified. "Oh," I responded, "Marine Corps. 1st Battalion, 4th Marines, 3rd Division. I was with Charlie Company." "So you were a grunt?" "Yes, ma'am." "My name's Margaret. You're lucky to find me here. I was about to leave for the day. I'm only here a few days a week." "I'm Jack." "You divorced?" Surprised, I responded, "Yes, twice. How did you know?" He said, "Not a big leap, Jack. Most of you guys are divorced." "You got a VA disability?" "Yeah, 30% PTSD, 50% Agent Orange." "You got a job?" "No." Then I caught myself and continued. "Well, I'm a writer. I just wrote a book." "Well, good for you," she said without enthusiasm, before continuing. "When was the last time you had a real job?" I thought for a few seconds. 4 or 5 years ago, I'd say, and I wasn't sure where this was going or why she suddenly seemed so interested in my background when minutes before she said that she was headed out the door. I took a breath and proceeded to recite the highlights of my recent life. Twice married and divorced, 5 jobs in 9 years. Should I keep going? Say you've had trouble holding a job. Would that be right? "I did have one for 17 years once," I said, in a weak attempt to defend myself. "Why did you leave?" "Because they were all assholes," I half laughed. "And the next 5? "Same deal," I said without laughing. Margaret Wojciechowicz is her name. went on to lead me through the maze of the disability claim I was trying to get, which was unemployability. And it was required the intervention of the Veterans, the Board of Veterans Affairs. You couldn't do it through the regular VA. It was a big deal. She directed it to VA lawyers who wrote up a case that it astounded me that somebody would go to that much work on my behalf for nothing, really. It took 4 years, and before it was finally granted. Some of you may recall, I just talking to somebody about this. During that time, and I write about this in the book, there was, one of the delays I had was that my first disability claim had been done when I lived on the Outer Banks in North Carolina when I was writing Loon, and the claim office was in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and so in order to complete my file, they had to get my file from Winston-Salem, North Carolina, up to Newark, New Jersey. And 6 months later, waiting for the file. 6 months later, checking, waiting for the file. So at some point I said, you know, I could just, felt like I had anything better to do. I could just drive down there and get the damn thing. And we sort of laughed and thought that was amusing. Around that time, there was a picture on the front page of the New York Times, along with a lead editorial about the VA. And the picture showed a picture of an office, big, I mean, you know, twice the size of this room anyway, with metal desks stacked this high with paper files. And the caption was, "The VA claim office in Winston-Salem, North Carolina." It had just been closed by the fire marshal, not because of all the paper, but because they were afraid the building was going to collapse. After that, things sped up somewhat. And I was successful. I heard from Margaret, coincidentally, before the book was published, but a month ago, needed something about, and I said, this is, and I got a pit in my stomach because I thought, oh, you know, shit, what did I write about her? I know I described her, but I can't remember what I said. So I told her, and then I sent her what I'd written, and she was actually very appreciative. She was a wonderful person in my life, just a great person, and she did more for me and other people, and she didn't get paid anything. She didn't get asked nothing in return. I went to check up on the claim once after about a year. I walked into the office. She was on the phone. Without looking up, she covered the mouthpiece and said, "I said 2 years." And then went on talking. Don't bother me. That was Margaret. I said at the beginning of this, and I'm almost finished, that this was a feel-good story. I don't think there's been too much feel-good that I've read, so I'd like to conclude with one of my favorite stories that really has nothing to do with any of this. In the spring of 2001, I reconnected with our former radio operator, Terry Tillery, in Mount Island, North Carolina. He was the first person, other than Bill, that I'd seen since Vietnam. This began a wonderful period when, largely thanks to the internet, Charlie Company began to come together again. Before we went to bed, this is my first visit. I drove 5 hours down in Mount Island, which those of you who read the book know that I did many times after that. Before we went to bed, well after midnight, I asked Terry where he had been after he left Vietnam. Having had 2 years left in his enlistment, he told me he'd been sent to the Marine Corps Sea School in Norfolk, Virginia, to prepare him for service aboard a Navy vessel. When he graduated, 6 weeks later, he said he was assigned to the Admiral's Aide on the nearly completed USS John F. Kennedy aircraft carrier. He would be one of 50 Marines serving on a ship that carried 5,000 Navy personnel. If you had to be in the Marine Corps, it was good duty. When the ship came out of dry dock, It deployed to the Mediterranean Sea, a common Cold War destination, shortly before the ship's arrival at the port of Caen, France. They were informed that members of the Kennedy family were gathering for a reunion that would include a shipboard celebration. On the day of the event, Liberty was canceled, the ship was scrubbed, the planes were moved topside, and that lower hangar was decorated to look much like a high school gymnasium on prom night, other than the working aircraft storage and maintenance facility that it was. All hands were ordered to stand by to give tours to the Kennedy family and answer their questions. The ship's band practiced while food and drink were prepared for the upcoming gala. At the appointed hour, Terry, in his full dress blue A uniform, stood erectly next to the Admiral with his back to the bulkhead. Scanning the dance floor, he noticed Rose Kennedy, the iconic matron of the Kennedy clan, was walking in their direction. He could feel the Admiral stand taller, so he stood taller. Mother of the late president and the recently slain senator, there was hardly a person in America at that time who did not recognize Rose Kennedy on sight. Good evening, gentlemen, she said when she stood before them. Good evening, ma'am. The Admiral responded stiffly. Extending her left arm, she said, "May I have the honor of this dance?" "Yes, ma'am," the Admiral responded. "The pleasure will be all mine." Caught momentarily off guard, Mrs. Kennedy stepped back slightly, shifted her gaze from the Admiral to Terry and said, "Thank you, Admiral, but I was speaking to the sergeant." And so it was that Sergeant Terry Tillery, a farmer's kid from Canfield, Ohio, on an evening aboard an aircraft carrier in Caen, France, danced with Rose Kennedy. "What did you talk about?" I continued. "I don't much remember," he said with a slight smile. "You know, just the usual shit, I guess." So, thank you, you've all been.